Introduction. The logical investigations, 1900 to 1901, opened a path which, as we know, the whole of phenomenology has followed. Up to the fourth edition, 1928, there was no fundamental change, no determined re-examination. Some touching up, certainly, and a powerful work of explication. Ideas I and formal and transcendental logic develop without break the concepts of intentional or noematic sense, the difference between the two strata of analytics in the strong sense, the pure forms of judgments and consequence logic, and suppress the deductivist or nomological form which had hitherto limited his concept of science in general. 1 In the crisis and texts of the same period, particularly in the origin of geometry, the conceptual premises of the investigations are still at work, notably when they concern all the problems of signification and language in general. In this area more than elsewhere, a patient reading of the investigations would show the germinal structure of the whole of Husserl's thought. On each page the necessity, or the implicit practice, of cytic and phenomenological reductions is visible, and the presence of everything to which they will give access is already discernible. But the first of the investigations, expression and meaning, opens with a chapter devoted to some essential distinctions which rigorously command all the subsequent analyses. And the coherence of this chapter is entirely due to a distinction proposed in the first paragraph. The word sign, Chen, will have a twofold sense. Ein Doppelsinn, sign may signify expression, Ausdruck, or indication, and Chen. In terms of what question are we to accept and read this apparently so portentous distinction? Before proposing this purely phenomenological distinction between the two senses of the word sign, or rather, even before recognizing it, before setting it off in what purports to be a simple description, Husserl proceeds to what is in effect a phenomenological reduction. He puts out of play all constituted knowledge. He insists on the necessary absence of presuppositions, Voraussetzungslogik, whether they come from metaphysics, psychology, or the natural sciences. The point of departure in the factum of language is not a presupposition, provided that one is attentive to the contingency of the example. Analyses thus directed keep their sense and their epistemological value, their import for the theory of knowledge, Erkenntnis theoretischen Wert, whether or not there exist any languages, whether beings such as men use them effectively or not, whether men or nature really exist, or exist only in the imagination and according to the mode of possibility. We have thus a prescription for the most general form of our question, do not phenomenological necessity, the rigor and subtlety of Husserl's analysis, the exigencies to which it responds and which we must first recognize, nonetheless conceal a metaphysical presupposition. Do they not harbor a dogmatic or speculative commitment which, to be sure, would not keep the phenomenological critique from being realized, would not be a residue of unperceived naivety, but would constitute phenomenology from within, in its project of criticism and in the instructive value of its own premises? This would be done precisely in what soon comes to be recognized as the source and guarantee of all value, the principle of principles, i.e., the original self-giving evidence, the present or presence of sense to a full and primordial intuition. In other words, we shall not be asking whether such and such metaphysical heritage has been able, here or there, to restrict the vigilance of the phenomenologist, but whether the phenomenological form of this vigilance is not already controlled by metaphysics itself. In the few lines just touched upon, distrust of metaphysical presuppositions is already presented as the condition for an authentic theory of knowledge ***, as if the project of a theory of knowledge, even when it has freed itself by the critique of such and such speculative system, did not belong at the outset to the history of metaphysics. Is not the idea of knowledge and of the theory of knowledge in itself metaphysical? What is at issue, then, in the privileged example of the concept of sign, is to see the phenomenological critique of metaphysics betray itself as a moment within the history of metaphysical assurance. Better still, our intention is to begin to confirm that the recourse to phenomenological critique is metaphysics itself, restored to its original purity in its historical achievement. We have tried elsewhere to follow the movement by which Husserl, while ceaselessly criticizing metaphysical speculation, in fact had his eye on only the perversion or the degeneracy of what he continued to believe in and wished to restore as authentic metaphysics or philosophy operates. Concluding his Cartesian meditations, Husserl again opposes authentic metaphysics, which will owe its accomplishment to phenomenology, to metaphysics in the customary sense. The results which he presents there are, he says, metaphysical, if it be true that ultimate cognitions of being should be called metaphysical. On the other hand, what we have here is anything but metaphysics in the customary sense, a historically degenerate metaphysics, which by no means conforms to the sense with which metaphysics, as first philosophy, was instituted originally. Phenomenology is purely intuitive, concrete, and also a apodictic mode of demonstration excludes all metaphysical adventure, all speculative excesses. Cartesian Meditations, 60, et. p. 139, for the unique and permanent motif of all the mistakes and distortions which Husserl exposes in degenerated metaphysics, across a multiplicity of domains, themes, and arguments, is always a blindness to the authentic mode of ideality, to that which is, to what may be indefinitely repeated in the identity of its presence, because of the very fact that it does not exist, is not real or is irreal, not in the sense of being a fiction, but in another sense which may have several names, whose possibility will permit us to speak of non-reality and essential necessity, the noema, the intelligible object, and in general the known worldly. This known worldliness is not another worldliness, this ideality is not an existent that has fallen from the sky, its origin will always be the possible repetition of a productive act. In order that the possibility of this repetition may be open, ideally to infinity, one ideal form must assure this unity of the indefinite and the ideal. This is the present, or rather the presence of the living present. The ultimate form of ideality, the ideality of ideality, that in which in the last instance one may anticipate or recall all repetition, is the living present, the self-presence of transcendental life. Presence has always been and will always, forever, be the form in which, we can say apodictically, the infinite diversity of contents is produced. The opposition between form and matter, which inaugurates metaphysics, finds in the concrete ideality of the living present its ultimate and radical justification. We will come back to the enigma of the concept of life in such expressions as living present and transcendental life. Let us note only, in order to here specify our intention, that phenomenology seems to us tormented, if not contested from within, by its own descriptions of the movement of temporalization and of the constitution of intersubjectivity. At the heart of what ties together these two decisive moments of description we recognize an irreducible non-presence as having a constituting value, and with it a non-life, a non-presence or non-self belonging of the living present, an ineradicable non-primordiality. The names which it assumes only render more palpable the resistance to the form of presence. Briefly, it is a question of 1. The necessary transition from retention to representation, Vertigenwortigung, in the constitution of the presence of a temporal object, Gegenstand, whose identity may be repeated, and 2. The necessary transition by way of a presentation in relation to the alter ego, that is, in relation to what also makes possible an ideal objectivity in general, for intersubjectivity is the condition for objectivity, which is absolute only in the case of ideal objects. What in the two cases is called a modification of presentation, representation, appresentation, Vertigenwortigung or a presentation, is not something that happens to presentation but rather conditions it by bifurcating it a priori. This does not impugn the apodicticity of the phenomenological transcendental description, nor does it diminish the founding value of presence. Besides, founding value of presence is a pleonistic expression. It is only a question of bringing out that the lack of foundation is basic and non-empirical and that the security of presence in the metaphorical form of ideality arises and is set forth again upon this irreducible void. It is within this compass that we will now question the phenomenological concept of the sign. The concept of metaphysics with which we shall be operating will have to be made precise and the excessive generality of this question narrowed. First, how can we justify the decision which subordinates a reflection on the sign to a logic? And if the concept of sign precedes logical reflection, is given to it, and is freed from its critique, from whence does it come? Where does the essence of the sign, according to which the concept is regulated, come from? What gives a theory of knowledge the authority to determine the essence and origin of language? We do not impute such a decision to Husserl, he explicitly assumes it, or rather he explicitly assumes its tradition and its validity. The consequences of this are limitless. On the one hand, Husserl had to postpone, from one end of his itinerary to the other, all explicit meditation on the essence of language in general. He still puts it out of play in the formal and transcendental logic, preliminary considerations too. And, as Fink has well shown, Husserl never raised the question of the transcendental logos, the inherited language in which phenomenology produces and exhibits the results of its reductive operations. The unity of ordinary language, or the language of traditional metaphysics, and the language of phenomenology is never broken in spite of the precautions, the renovations or innovations. Transforming a traditional concept into an indicative or metaphorical concept does not eliminate its heritage, it imposes questions, rather, to which Husserl never ventured a response. This is due to the fact that, on the other hand, being interested in language only within the compass of rationality, determining the logos from logic, Husserl had, in a most traditional manner, determined the essence of language by taking the logical as its telos or norm. That this telos is that of being as presence is what we here wish to suggest. Thus, for example, when Husserl redefines the relation between the purely grammatical and the purely logical, a relation which traditional logic would have lacked, distorted as it was by metaphysical presuppositions, when he institutes a pure morphology of Bedeutungen, we do not translate this word for reasons which will appear in a moment. To explain the purely grammatical, what results is that the generality of this meta-empirical grammar is not sufficient to cover the whole field of possibility for language in general, it does not exhaust the whole extension of languages a priori. When we speak of the purely grammatical, we mean that system of rules which enables us to recognize whether or not a discourse is, properly speaking, a discourse. Speech, to be sure, must make sense, but do falsity and the absurdity of contradiction, widersinnigkeit, necessarily make it unintelligible? Do they necessarily deprive discourse of its experienced and intelligible character, thereby rendering it sin-loss? This grammar concerns only the logical a priori of language, it is pure logical grammar. This restriction is operative from the beginning, although Husserl does not insist on it in the first edition of the Investigations. In the first edition I spoke of pure grammar, a name conceived and expressly devised to be analogous to Kampf's pure science of nature. Since it cannot, however, be said that pure formal semantic, Bedeutungen, theory comprehends the entire a priori of general grammar, there is, for example, a peculiar a priori governing relations of mutual understanding among minded persons, relations introduction /9 very important for grammar. Talk of pure logical grammar is to be preferred. 5 The delineation of the logical a priori within the general a priori of language does not set apart a region, rather it designates, as we shall see, the dignity of a telos, the purity of a norm, and the essence of a destination. That this gesture, whereby the whole of phenomenology is already involved, repeats the original intention of metaphysics itself is what we wish to show here by pointing out in the first of the Investigations those roots which will remain undisturbed by Husserl's subsequent discourse. The factor of presence, the ultimate court of appeal for the whole of this discourse, is itself modified, without being lost, each time there is a question of the presence, in the two related senses, of the proximity of what is set forth as an object of an intuition, and the proximity of the temporal present which gives the clear and present intuition of the object its form, of any object whatever to consciousness, in the clear evidence of a fulfilled intuition. Indeed, the element of presence is modified whenever it is a question of self-presence in consciousness, where consciousness means nothing other than the possibility of the self-presence of the present in the living present. Every time this element of presence becomes threatened, Husserl will awaken it, recall it, and bring it back to itself in the form of a telos, that is, an idea in the Kantian sense. There is no ideality without there being an idea in the Kantian sense at work, opening up the possibility of something indefinite, the infinity of a stipulated progression or the infinity of permissible repetitions. This ideality is the very form in which the presence of an object in general may be indefinitely repeated as the same. The non-cality of the Bedeutung, the non-reality of the ideal object, the non-reality of the inclusion of sense or noema in consciousness, Husserl will say that the noema does not really, belong to consciousness, will thus give the assurance that presence to consciousness can be indefinitely repeated, ideal presence to an ideal or transcendental consciousness. Ideality is the preservation or mastery of presence in repetition. In its pure form, this presence is the presence of nothing existing in the world, it is a correlation with the acts of repetition, themselves ideal. Is this to say that what opens the repetition to the infinite, or what is opened up when the movement of idealization is assured, is a certain relation of an existent to his death? and that the transcendental life is the scene of this relationship. It is too soon to tell. First we must deal with the problem of language. No one will be surprised if we say that language is properly the medium for this play of presence and absence. Is there not within language, is it not language itself that might seem to unify life and ideality? But we ought to consider, on the one hand, that the element of signification, or the substance of expression, which best seems to preserve ideality and living presence in all its forms is living speech, the spirituality of the breath as phone, and, on the other hand, that phenomenology, the metaphysics of presence in the form of ideality, is also a philosophy of life. It is a philosophy of life, not only because at its center death is recognized as but an empirical and extrinsic signification, a worldly accident, but because the source of sense in general is always determined as the act of living, as the act of a living being, as Lebendigkeit. But the unity of living, the focus of Lebendigkeit which diffracts its light in all the fundamental concepts of phenomenology, Leben, Erlebnis, Lebendigkeit, Geistigkeit, etc., escapes the transcendental reduction and, as unity of worldly life, even opens up the way for it. When the empirical life, or even the region of the purely psychic, is bracketed, it is still a transcendental life or, in the final instance, the transcendentality of a living present that Husserl uncovers. And yet he thematizes the concept of life without as much as raising the question of its unity. The soulless, Seelen loses, consciousness whose essential possibility is redeemed in ideas I, 54, is still a living transcendental consciousness. If we concluded, with a very Husserlian gesture, that the concepts of empirical, or in general, worldly, life and transcendental life are radically heterogeneous and that the two names sustain a simply indicative or metaphorical relation between themselves, then it is upon the possibility of this relation that the whole weight of the question falls. The common root that makes all these metaphors possible still seems to us to be the concept of life. There is, in the final instance, says Husserl, a relation of parallelism between the purely mental, the region of the world opposed to transcendental consciousness and discovered by the reduction of the totality of the natural and transcendent world, and pure transcendental life. Phenomenological psychology will have to continue to call upon psychology to work over its fund of eidetic presuppositions and the conditions for its own language. It has the task of fixing the sense of concepts derived from psychology, and first of all the sense of what is called the psyche. But what will distinguish this phenomenological psychology, this descriptive science, eidetic and a priori, from transcendental phenomenology itself? What will distinguish the epoch which discloses the immanent domain of the purely psychic from the transcendental epoch itself? For the field opened up by this pure psychology has a privilege with respect to all other regions, and its generality dominates all others. Its domain necessarily includes all lived experiences, and the sense of every determinate region or object is betokened through it. Also, the dependence of the purely psychic upon the transcendental consciousness, as proto-region, is quite singular. For the domain of pure psychological experience incorporates the total domain of what Husserl calls transcendental experience. Yet despite this perfect incorporation, a radical difference remains, one having nothing in common with any other difference, a difference in fact distinguishing nothing, a difference separating no state, no experience, no determined signification, but a difference which, without altering anything, changes all the signs, and in which alone the possibility of a transcendental question is contained. That is to say, freedom itself. A fundamental difference, thus, without which no other difference in the world would either make any sense or have the chance to appear as such. Without the possibility and the recognition of such a duplication, Verdoppelung, whose rigor tolerates no duplicity, without this invisible distance held out between the two acts of the epoch, transcendental phenomenology would be destroyed in its root. The difficulty lies in that this duplication of sense must correspond to no ontological double. Husserl specifies, for example, that my transcendental ego is radically different from my natural and human ego, 6 and yet it is distinguished by nothing, nothing that can be determined in the natural sense of distinction. The transcendental ego is not another. It is certainly not the formal or metaphysical phantom of the empirical ego. Indeed, this leads us to take the ego, as absolute spectator of its own psychic self, to be but a theoretical image and metaphor. We would also expose the analogical character of language which must sometimes be used to announce the transcendental reduction as well as to describe that unusual object the psychic self as it confronts the absolute transcendental self. In fact, no language can cope with the operation by which the transcendental ego constitutes and opposes itself to its worldly self, its soul, reflecting itself in a world-like and Selbstperception. 7 The pure soul is this strange self-objectification, Selbstabjektivierung, of the monad in and by itself. 8 Here, too, the soul originates in the one, monadic ego, and may be freely turned toward it in a reduction. All these difficulties are concentrated in the enigmatic concept of parallelism. Husserl evokes 9 the surprising parallelism and even, if one may say, incorporation of phenomenological psychology and transcendental phenomenology, both of them understood as eidetic disciplines. The one inhabits the other, as it were, implicitly. This nothing that distinguishes the parallels, this nothing without which precisely no explication, that is, no language, could be freely developed in the service of truth without being deformed by some reed contact, this nothing without which no transcendental, that is, philosophical, question could be opened, this nothing arises, so to speak, when the totality of the world is neutralized in its existence and is reduced to its phenomenal being. This operation is that of the transcendental reduction, it may in no case be that of the psychophenomenological reduction. The pure eidetic of psychic experience doubtless concerns no determined existence, no matter of empirical fact, it makes no appeal to any signification transcendent to consciousness. But the essences it fixes intrinsically presuppose the existence of the world in the form of that worldly region called psyche. Moreover, we must notice that this parallelism does more than release transcendental ether, it renders more mysterious still, as it alone is capable of doing, the meaning of the mental and of mental life, that is, of a worldliness capable of sustaining, or in some way nourishing, transcendentality, and of equaling the full scope of its domain, yet without being merged with it in some total adequation. To conclude that this parallelism is an adequation is the most tempting, the most subtle, but also the most obscuring of confusions, transcendental psychologism. Against it we must maintain the precarious and fragile distance between the parallels, against it we must ceaselessly direct our questions. But since the meaning of the transcendental consciousness is not affected by the hypothesis of the destruction of the world, ideas I, 49, certainly an incorporeal and, paradoxical as it may sound, even an inanimate, Seelen loses, and non-personal consciousness is conceivable, Ibid. 954, et. p. 167. 10 Moreover, the transcendental consciousness is nothing more and nothing other than the psychological consciousness. Transcendental psychologism misunderstands this. If the world needs the supplement of a soul, the soul, which is in the world, needs this supplementary nothing which is the transcendental and without which no world would appear. But, on the other hand, we must, if we are to be attentive to Husserl's renewal of the notion of transcendental, refrain from attributing any reality to this distance, substantializing this non-consistency or making it be, even merely analogically, something or some moment of the world. This would be to extinguish the light at its source. If language never escapes analogy, if it is indeed analogy through and through, it ought, having arrived at this point, at this stage, freely to assume its own destruction and cast metaphor against metaphor, all of which amounts to complying with the most traditional of imperatives, something which has received its most explicit but not most original form in the Aeneid and has ceaselessly and faithfully been transmitted right up to the introduction to metaphysics, especially by Bergson. It is at the price of this war of language against itself that the sense and question of its origin will be thinkable. This war is obviously not one war among others. A polemic for the possibility of sense and world, it takes place in this difference, which, we have seen, cannot reside in the world but only in language, in the transcendental disquietude of language. Indeed, far from only living in language, this war is also the origin and residence of language. Language preserves the difference that preserves language. Later, in his Nachwort zu meinen Ideen /11 and in the Cartesian Meditations, 14 and 57, Husserl will again briefly invoke this precise parallel between the pure psychology of consciousness and the transcendental phenomenology of consciousness. And in order to deny that transcendental psychologism which makes a genuine philosophy impossible, Cartesian Meditations, 14, he will then say that at all costs we shall have to practice the Nuancierung, Nachwort p. 557, which distinguishes the parallels, one of which is in the world and the other outside the world without being in another world, that is, without ceasing to be, like every parallel, alongside, right next to the other. We must stringently assemble and protect in our discourse these frivolous, subtle, geringviergeigen, seemingly trivial nuances which make a decisive difference between right and wrong paths, of philosophy, Cartesian Meditations, 14. Our discussion ought to incorporate these protected nuances and thereby at the same time consolidate in them its own possibility and rigor. But the strange unity of these two parallels, that which refers the one to the other, does not allow itself to be sundered by them and, by dividing itself, finally joins the transcendental to its other. This unity is life. One finds out quickly enough that the sole nucleus of the concept of psyche is life as self-relationship, whether or not it takes place in the form of consciousness. Living is thus the name of that which precedes the reduction and finally escapes all the divisions which the latter gives rise to. But this is precisely because it is its own division and its own opposition to its other. In determining living in this way, we come to designate the origin of the insecurity of discourse, precisely the point where it can no longer assure its possibility and rigor within the nuance. This concept of life is then grasped in an instance which is no longer that of pre-transcendental knived, the language of day-to-day life or biological science. But if this ultra-transcendental concept of life enables us to conceive life, in the ordinary or the biological sense, and if it has never been inscribed in language, it requires another name. We will be less astonished before this oblique and laborious, tenacious endeavor of phenomenology to protect the spoken word, to affirm an essential tie between logos and PhDNE, when we remember that consciousness owes its privileged status, about which Husserl in the end never asked what it was, in spite of the admirable, interminable, and in so many respects revolutionary, meditation he devoted to it, to the possibility of a living vocal medium, la vive voix. Since self-consciousness appears only in its relation to an object, whose presence it can keep and repeat, it is never perfectly foreign or anterior to the possibility of language. Husserl no doubt did want to maintain, as we shall see, an originally silent, pre-expressive stratum of experience. But since the possibility of constituting ideal objects belongs to the essence of consciousness, and since these ideal objects are historical products, only appearing thanks to acts of creation or intending, the element of consciousness and the element of language will be more and more difficult to discern. Will not their indiscernibility introduce non-presence and difference, mediation, signs, referral back, etc., in the heart of self-presence? This difficulty calls for a response. This response is the voice, la voix. The voice is richly and profoundly enigmatic in all that it here seems to answer. That the voice simulates the conservation of presence, and that the history of spoken language is the archives of this simulation, this at once prevents us from considering the difficulty *** to which, in Husserl's phenomenology, the voice answers as a difficulty of the system or a contradiction proper to it. This prevents us also from describing this simulation, whose structure is of an infinite complexity, as an illustration, phantasm, or hallucination. These last concepts, on the contrary, refer to the simulation of language as well as to their common root. It remains that this difficulty structures the whole of Husserl's discourse and that we ought to recognize the work involved therein. Husserl will radicalize the necessary privilege of the Phonuro 9 which is implied by the whole history of metaphysics, and exploit all its resources with the greatest critical refinement. For it is not in the sonorous substance or in the physical voice, in the body of speech in the world, that he will recognize an original affinity with the logos in general, but in the voice phenomenologically taken, speech in its transcendental flesh, in the breath, the intentional animation that transforms the body of the word into flesh, makes of the Körper Leib, a geistige Leiblichkeit. The phenomenological voice would be this spiritual flesh that continues to speak and be present to itself, to hear itself, in the absence of the world. Of course, what one accords to the voice is accorded to the language of words, a language constituted of unities, which one might have believed irreducible, which cannot be broken down, joining the signified concept to the signifying phonic complex. Despite the vigilance of the description, a perhaps naive treatment of the concept of word has doubtless left unresolved the tension of the two major motifs in phenomenology, the purity of formalism and the radicality of intuitionism. that the privilege of presence as consciousness can be established, that is, historically constituted and demonstrated, only by virtue of the excellence of the voice is a truism which has never occupied the forefront of the phenomenological stage. In a mode neither simply operative nor directly thematic, in a place neither central nor peripheral, the necessity of this truism seems to have assured itself a sort of hold throughout phenomenology. The nature of this hold is poorly conceived in the concepts habitually sanctioned in the philosophy of the history of philosophy. But our purpose here is not directly to meditate upon the form of this hold but only to show it already, and powerfully, at work from the start, in the first of the logical investigations.